Interviewing people with disabilities. This episode provides novice oral historians an overview of considerations and accommodations for interviewing people with disabilities. It does not offer a comprehensive list of all the potential issues that oral historians might face while interviewing, but it offers a guide from which to learn and build experience. When interacting with people with disabilities, recognize their autonomy and respect their rights. The accommodations needed for each individual may be unique. This module offers suggestions, but cannot anticipate individual needs. Many of these lessons are applicable to interviewing all people, but for people who have been historically marginalized and exploited by researchers, it's vitally important to conduct ethical, collaborative, and inclusive oral history projects. Shared authority and power. Nothing about us without us. Disability activists borrowed this language from anti-apartheid activists in South Africa, highlighting the power of voice among historically oppressed and marginalized groups. Activists have argued that any ethical research that involves people with disabilities should also include them. This means that oral historians should not only share authority with narrators during the interview, if at all possible, they should involve the research subjects at every stage in the process, from project planning and advising to interpreting and editing. You want to be sure that you are not imposing yourself on the voice of others or representing the experiences of people outside the context and intent of the oral history. Power dynamics are especially important to keep in mind when interviewing people with disabilities. An interviewer may unintentionally coerce a person into participating in a project or answering a question that makes them feel uncomfortable. It's a best practice to ensure that a narrator freely and of their own will participates in a project. This process begins with communication. In the past, medical researchers have exploited and abused the research subjects by performing medical experiments, eugenics, and other inhumane practices. This history is why institutional review boards oversee research with human subjects to ensure ethical research. The unfortunate problem with these boards is that sometimes they do not recognize the agency of people with disabilities, and their restrictions sometimes contradict self-advocacy. Nonetheless, with proper training, experience, communication, oral historians can include people with disabilities in their projects, providing a greater platform for their voices to be heard and for their experiences to be recorded. Shared authority and collaboration. Many people with disabilities are more than capable of collaborating and engaging in a dialectic relationship with an interviewer and providing illuminating insights into lived experiences, while also being able to place their individual experiences within a larger social context. While preparing for an oral history interview with a person with a disability, do as much research on the topic as possible. But it's essential to the relationship between the oral historian and the narrator that you acknowledge that the narrator is the expert on their experiences of disability. People do oral history because they hope to learn from people. Recognize the value in a narrator's perspective. Considering someone with a disability in the role of a teacher makes a significant impact on the interview.
There's the tendency in, I'll frame it as an oral history scenario. So the oral history scenario would be that able-bodied people that don't identify, or it could even be somebody with a disability, but they don't think of themselves as having a disability, so they don't identify in that way. They go in and they say, okay, these are the questions that I think those people would be, really great at answering, and me and my friends will just come up with a really great set of questions, and we'll have 10 questions, and we'll set up the interview in this way, and we'll get it all hammered out. This is great. And they go and they swoop in, they do the questions, and they get their answers, and they leave. That's the without us part. Because I think in a way, the nature of what you were asking just now about, how the experience of interviewing somebody else with a disability plays in, that's where you start getting into the territory of what the advantages are if you don't do the without us. It's always with us. So in an oral history situation, you might get, if people with disabilities are coming up with the questions and people with disabilities are coming up with the, kind of the takeaway goals and, all of that, if they're key in the process, then it's going to be much more of an inclusive and a more whole and kind of complex, messy process rather than people thinking that they understand something when they don't. And they might understand it. That's the other piece. I'm not saying that just because somebody's able-bodied, they're going to not get it, or that just because somebody's disabled, they're going to get it. But nonetheless, to be aware that a disability perspective brings something to the mix, I think is really important. And that should be part of the planning, the structuring, kind of just the whole process at every level.
There were some people who didn't want to be interviewed. I mean, there just were. There were, and for a variety of reasons, and you respect that. There were other people who, and not too many, but there were some people who you do the interview, and then somewhere along the line they would say, you know what, I just don't want to do this anymore, for whatever reason. And depending on where in the process it got shut down, that's where you'd stop. I'm thinking of one person in particular who, we went through the whole process of the interviews. I went down to Washington, interviewed the person. We transcribed the interviews, and then the general process was the interviews would be transcribed, and then the person who was interviewed would get a copy of the transcription. And depending on, some people wanted to go through it page by page, which was great, I think. It is particularly good for people like, I'm just going to throw some names out, Thomas Gilhul, who was the lead attorney in Parkview, Pennsylvania. But Tom went through his interview with me page by page because it was very technical stuff. It was very, he's an attorney. He not only did Park, which if you're drawing analogies, I tell people Park is kind of like the Brown v. Board of the disability rights movement. It was the first time Park, together with Mills v. Board, which was brought in D.C. at about the same time, those two cases were the first time really that the federal court had ever said a person with a disability had rights as people with disabilities that had to be respected by government. There were a lot of legal. I'm not an attorney, so there were terms and concepts with which I wasn't familiar. And we had a great time. Tom was wonderful. I knew him. That's right. I knew him because, and this also speaks to the issue of how my introduction to the community. When I wrote my first book, I had a sort of committee of advisors because I knew that there was a lot of material that I could get wrong. And so I had people in the deaf community, people in the mental patients liberation community, people in independent living, and Tom was one of the people who was on my kind of oversight committee, and I would send him drafts of the encyclopedia, portions of it or the entire draft to some people, and they would go through that with an eye toward, real awful mistakes, which would be very embarrassing had they been published. And I was very grateful that, it was like maybe 2 dozen people were willing to take the time with me to make sure that the book was as accurate as it could be. So I knew Tom from that. So that was that introduction there.
What you're describing, this process of reviewing the materials, that's part of a larger goal called shared authority, right? That's a term from Michael Frisch. And so in your experience, what is the importance of shared authority as it relates to people with disabilities?
Well, historically, people with disabilities in general have had no authority at all. I mentioned the term eugenics. Are you familiar with anything? Okay. That is, that is an appalling history of people being denied, people being incarcerated for no crime whatsoever, other than the crime of having a disability. People being, Buck v. Bell was the Supreme Court ruling. When was that? 1927, I want to say. I'd have to look it up, but that Buck v. was like the Plessy v. Ferguson of the. If Park v. Pennsylvania was Brown v. Board, then Buck v. Bell was like, it was basically saying people with disabilities have no rights that anybody in government are required to respect. If you think that this person is a threat to the community, you can sterilize them against their will, you can incarcerate them against their will, you can incarcerate them till the end of their life. You can take their children away. You can deny them the right to have children. You can deny them the right to education. I mean, so the kind of oppression, particularly, I mean, the folks I was talking to when I began the oral history book, I talked about this process of prioritizing. One of the criteria for prioritizing was age. You know, I mean, people who were in their 70s and 80s and 90s, I wanted to get to fast because for obvious reasons. And these were people who had just incredible histories of oppression.
And so then by granting that shared authority, you're trying to not only acknowledge the humanity of people with disabilities, but also their agency?
Yeah, well, absolutely, absolutely. I was very aware that, you know, depending on the individuals, that I was talking to people who had had a long history of being ignored, slighted, oppressed, pushed around, particularly people who'd been institutionalized. But, you know, all kinds of issues that would come up. You know, one of the issues that came up in a number of cases were people who presented histories of sexual abuse, of being raped, being abused, and this has happened in the disability community with just incredible frequency. I mean, far greater rates than in the general population. So that's a reality. I mean, that is a reality you had to deal with. And it's a part of the history that you definitely want to record, right? I mean, because 100 years from now, 200 years from now, you're going to want people to know that this was an aspect of people's lived experience. But at the same time, you're talking to somebody who has been through this incredible trauma. You want to be respectful of that, and you want them to be the ones to draw the boundary, right? So, in any number of occasions, there would people who would say, "I will tell you this story, but I don't want it as part of the shared history at this point." You know, we had a process of redacting, which I would explain to everybody if there are issues if there are portions that you want to have redacted, we have a way to do that. You can say, you know, I don't want this to be made available until 25 years after my death, 50 years after my death, and all kinds of reasons for that. People worried about being retaliated against, people embarrassed, the shame that still attaches to being an abuse survivor, people who shared histories of incest, and their parents are still alive. They don't want necessarily everybody in the world to know about this, but at the same time, they want it as part of the history.
Oral history and social change. Oral history can be a powerful and empowering tool for social change. Over the past several decades, disability scholars have recognized the value of using oral history to amplify the voices of people with disabilities, illustrating the agency and self-advocacy of people with disabilities to inspire and affect social change. For example, Fred Pelka's groundbreaking work, What We Have Done, documents the history of the disability rights movement, records the voices of the people who demanded to be heard, to be recognized as people with human rights, and heralded the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act. Two other notable works give examples of oral history redressing systemic issues in healthcare involving people with disabilities. Good Times, Bad Times, Women with Learning Difficulties Telling Their Stories, and Witness to Change, Families, Learning Difficulties, and History. These projects give insight into the history of intellectual disability and the potential of oral history to influence policy. Oral histories with people with disabilities, in these cases, provided irrefutable evidence that people with intellectual disabilities make connections between their personal experiences and greater social context, with the capabilities of not only self-advocacy, but also advocacy for others.
What would you be aware of as far as how a student or an interviewer should interact within your private space of your home?
I don't know. Just be a gracious guest, there was a process, right? I mean, I would never just knock on somebody's door and say, "Hi, I'm doing an oral history, and I know you're a person who's involved with disability rights, and can I come in?" I mean, And maybe what I have to do is go back and talk about a little bit more about my history with oral histories. I did this encyclopedia, and that was published in '97. And then in 2000, I was contacted by Mary Lou Breslin, who, together with Susan O'Hara, were the founders of something. I'm going to throw a lot of acronyms at you. They were the founders of DRILLM at ROHO. DRILLM was the Project on the Disability Rights and Independent Living Movements. ROHO is the Regional Oral History Office at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. Originally, Mary Lou and Susan had started this project because, as I said, the first Center for Independent Living was founded in the San Francisco area, and they felt, and Ed Roberts had passed away, and other people who were involved in the founding of that were getting older, passing away, and they felt very strongly that history should be recorded. So they began in the mid-1990s with this project to do oral histories around the San Francisco area. And then in 2000, they got funding to expand that to include the entire country. And when that happened, because I'd written this encyclopedia, they gave me a call and said, we're doing this project. Would you like to be our Northeast? I did everything from Maine to D.C., with the exception of New York City. They had someone who specifically did New York City. But I would, my job over the next 10 years was to collect interviews of people who were in the disability rights movement or were witnesses to important events in the movement, in the history, and that's what I did. I spent a decade doing that. So we had a whole protocol, a whole process. I mean, we would generate lists of people who we felt were important to interview, and then we would prioritize those lists. And then, in my case, and I think this is the case with everyone, I'd go off and do as much research as I could on that individual, and then I would contact the individual in whatever way and say, here's who I am, here's what I'm doing, here's what I'm interested in talking to you about, this is our project. By that time, we probably had some stuff online. I mean, 2005, 2006 for sure. So here's the website if you want to go see it. Here, I'll send you my background. I'll answer any questions you might have, concerns you might have, and then we would set up the interview. I think generally we would send a list of questions with the understanding that we weren't necessarily confined to those particular questions, that this was like an outline. And then I'd show up with my recording equipment, and off we'd go.
Language and disability. Language, as in any oral history interview, must be grounded in respect and thoughtfulness. In some interviews, disability as a term may be uncomfortable. The use of language may be considered before the interview begins, as these issues could vary considerably depending on the narrator, the interviewer's relationship to the term and their positionality, the topic of discussion, the individual's personal definitions of the term, and the circumstances of a narrator's disability, such as if one is born with a disability or experienced some disabling event. These suggestions about language may be more applicable to interviewing people with mobility or sensory differences. For example, many deaf people may not consider deafness a disability. If you do have concerns about language, consider raising these questions during the pre-interview stage, once you have created rapport with the narrator. Again, communicate your concerns and grant them the agency to determine how to shape their stories, which includes the language you use to talk about their disability. Disability culture advocates and disability scholars have challenged the rationale for using person-first language exclusively and have promoted identity-first language instead. Some people have suggested that using person-first language can also marginalize people because it suggests that disability is something to be ashamed of. In the same way that other marginalized groups have taken back language that describes identity, so too have some people in the disability communities. For example, some people in autism communities prefer the term autistic person as opposed to person with autism because they consider autism as part of their identity. However, even within autism communities, people differ greatly on preferences. As some disability scholars have argued, the minority model or the diversity model portrays disability as a neutral or even positive, as well as a natural characteristic or human attribute. We cannot make any specific recommendation on language that will be appropriate for all people, but you should be aware of some of the concerns and the reasons for these differing positions. Oral history, trauma, and disability. Doing oral history with anyone can elicit trauma, but these issues are especially important to consider when interviewing people with disabilities because many may have experienced trauma or experienced hardship while growing up. The Department of Justice reported in 2017 that people with disabilities were 2.5 times more likely to be the victims of violence and nearly 3 times more likely to be raped. The next section provides a review of ethical practices for when trauma resurfaces during an interview. As you recall from earlier modules, oral history seeks to capture the voice of narrators and their personal and usually intimate life experiences. Recounting memories can resurface trauma or emotional difficulty. These considerations are perhaps especially true in interviewing people with disabilities. While doing oral history can be therapeutic or cathartic, oral historians are not typically trained counselors. Nevertheless, with proper experience and careful attention, oral historians can address trauma during an interview in an ethical, responsible, and respectful way. The highest priority of an ethical oral historian is to protect the well-being of the narrator. If trauma ever resurfaces during an interview, consider the following steps, all of which are grounded in respect and empathy. Ask if the narrator would like to take a break or pause the interview. Give appropriate space for narrators to decide if and when they would like to continue. Use other questions to guide the interview away from trauma. It's helpful to have a few questions readily available that ask narrators to reflect on more positive life experiences. Cardinal rules continued. Stop the interview if necessary. The well-being of the narrator is always more important than the research. Remember the pro tip: before the interview starts, inform the narrators they may take a break at any time, they do not have to answer any questions that make them uncomfortable, and they may stop at any time. If the interview is stopped, be sure to ask for permission to restart. Offer the option of continuing the interview at a later date if possible. Sometimes the trauma resurfaces after the interview. This can cause depression, nightmares, or thoughts of suicide. Always follow up after the interview, but especially if you think trauma may have resurfaced. An ethical and responsible oral historian should follow up with a visit or a phone call to the narrator after the interview, make arrangements for the narrator to seek counseling services, and provide them with resources. Pro tip: inform narrators that trauma may resurface during and sometimes after an interview. Consider asking narrators if they have access to appropriate counseling services before an interview.
So as an interviewer in a situation like that, whenever a topic so private and traumatic occurs, how do you respond in that moment?
Well, first of all, I mean, you want to listen. You listen to the story. People will generally define for themselves. They'll say, look, I'm going to tell you something, but I don't want this repeated. And then I would say, and sometimes I would say, look, if you want to tell me something that you think I need to know as background, and this is like a journalism thing, I'll turn off the tape recorder. That's kind of an anachronism. I'll turn off the recorder, and we can go from there. You tell me when you're comfortable continuing, resuming the interview, or if it was on tape or recorded, they would have the chance when they got the transcript, just to say, at any point where you're the one who is defining the parameters here. I mean, it's your decision, not mine. And people, generally speaking, people want to tell their stories. People. I ran into very few people once they agreed to the interview. I mean, like I said, there were people who didn't want to be interviewed, and for a variety of reasons. But once people agreed to be interviewed, generally people were willing to do like full disclosure. Generally speaking, people want their stories told, especially people, like I say, who've been marginalized, who've been told that their stories are worthless. So you can imagine how people who've been institutionalized, people who have been through this kind of trauma, might be affected by that.
That's one of the greatest rewards of doing this type of work. It sounds like a lot of these stories are quite difficult to hear, and I just wonder, how did you experience that? Do you carry those stories with you? Is that emotionally difficult for you as a person to in to listen so much to so many painful stories?
It can be. I mean, I thought, I've had some experience with this in other aspects. I mean, I spent a couple of weeks, not a whole long time, but 3 weeks a month in Croatia during the war there, and so I went to refugee centers and interviewed people who had been incarcerated in rape camps, and that was really hard. that was and particularly because in a situation like that, you really want to. I mean, I do. I don't know about other people, but I really felt quite useless in that context. I mean, here I was running around. It was one of the people I talked to said, I just remember this. I explained who I was and what I was doing, and she said, "Oh, you're a genocide tourist." So yeah, that can be hard, and to hear some of these stories can be really hard. And I don't know if while you're hearing them, I mean, I think sometimes it's important to acknowledge. But this interview didn't end up in the book, and I don't think it's been fully transcribed yet. But the recordings are at the Bancroft Library. And he was a veteran. He had been disabled in a plane crash at the end of World War II, and so I'm interviewing him in the 2000s. He's in his 80s or whatever. And I mean, he began to weep because he not only did he become seriously physically disabled. I mean, he was paraplegic or maybe even quadriplegic, but his wife abandoned him, took their children, never saw his children again. And I'm listening to this thinking, oh my God. And I said something like that. I said, so not only did you have to deal with just the fact of your disability and the trauma of being in a plane crash, for God's sake, but then you just lost everything. You lost your marriage, you lost your family, he sort of broke down and said, yeah, I haven't thought of this in 30 years, 40 years. I mean, so yeah, you have to. I mean, I don't know. Everyone has to bring their own resources to hearing a story like that, but what takes you through it is knowing the importance of recording that story, of getting it down. So I don't know if that's an answer.
No, that's a great answer. That's an issue I've come to reckon with recently in my own work. It feels a lot like I've said this elsewhere, but it feels a lot like collecting souls. Like you're a stranger who's invited momentarily into someone's life, and then you take away part of their experience with you. So it's a very unique, but it's also a privilege and an honor. And whatever impact it has in that moment on an interviewer, I mean, that's the life of the narrator.
Photographs, video, and audio. As mentioned in a previous module, be sure to ask narrators during the pre-interview if they have any issues being photographed or recorded on video or audio. Most people are self-conscious about having their photographs taken, especially if they are caught unaware. Let your narrator know the media with which you intend to record their interviews so that they may prepare accordingly. Be courteous and ask for permission. Not only is this a best practice, it is covered by copyright law. Networking and building community. Developing a trustful relationship with people with disabilities and community organizations that support them is especially important to an oral history project. Disability scholars discuss the importance of communicating and explaining in the clearest terms the purposes of the project, topics discussed, and what will happen to the interviews. Some people with intellectual disability may require assistance from a caretaker, interpreter, or family member. Make sure that you communicate primarily with the narrator and only with the caretaker when necessary. A proxy may be necessary to sign informed consent, but be sure that you or they do not infantilize the narrator. When a person cannot legally provide consent, a legal guardian may sign informed consent, but the narrator should also provide assent or explicitly agree to participate. Even if a person may be illiterate, for example, they are still capable of making decisions for themselves. You should explain the project to them clearly and ask for their consent too. As with any oral history project, making contact in a community of interest can be vitally important when launching an oral history project, developing professional relationships, as well as building trust and rapport. To establish professional reputation and grow your network, consider doing an oral history interview with a leader or a respected person in a community, or provide examples of oral histories to help explain the project. This person can help recruit and introduce you to other potential narrators. Be sure to communicate directly with the potential narrators. Some caretakers may try to paternalize or make decisions for them. With each person you come into contact with, be sure to interact in friendly but professional ways. Oral history projects often grow through word of mouth. Making great impressions on a community can lead to a snowball effect. That is, when one interview leads to more and then exponentially grows. The pre-interview is discussed in much greater detail in episode 3. However, let's briefly review the goals of a pre-interview session. After making contact with a potential narrator, you should attempt to schedule a pre-interview by phone, video conference, or in person. The pre-interview is an important moment in the oral history process because it's usually the first time that you will meet the potential narrator. You want to be friendly, approachable, and professional. Start building rapport immediately. Interacting with the narrator before you interview will help ease any anxieties or concerns during the interview. Also, during the pre-interview, you should synthesize the information in the invitation letter, clearly articulate the goals of the project, expectations, time commitments, and gather relevant biographical information, which will help you further define your research questions. Keep in mind that an invitation letter may not be the most appropriate way to communicate with some people who have disabilities. Consider the unique circumstances of each narrator and decide the most effective ways to communicate an invitation to participate in an oral history project. Some researchers offer the possibility for participants to use aliases or anonymity. But, as discussed in the module on ethics, guaranteeing anonymity can be nearly impossible in an oral history interview. In addition to these goals of any pre-interview meeting, if you are interviewing someone with a disability, you should communicate with them and ask questions about any additional accommodations they may require. Depending on the nature of the person's disability, oral historians may need to take additional measures to ensure accessibility. A person with a disability may require a more accessible informed consent document, always with clear language, perhaps with Braille, larger fonts, assistive software, screen readers, or a trusted preparer. Some people may require a translator or interpreter. People with intellectual disability, for example, may need a guardian to facilitate the interaction and interpret the informed consent document. These proxies should be involved throughout the oral history project. Pro tip: if a person with a disability does have a caretaker, guardian, translator, or assistant, address the person, not the assistant. Recognize the agency of the person with the disability and speak with them with respect and mindfulness.
Are you aware of other ethical considerations that especially students should be aware of?
I'm thinking of, again, somebody maybe translating for another person. I mean, sort of say somebody's mother is speaking for them or something like that. That's always a little, like say there's a situation where there's two people. This is hypothetical, but say you've got somebody with an intellectual disability, and then you've got the mother there, the parent, and they answer for the child. And the child could be an adult, right? And there's often this infantilization of disability that happens. And that is a weird sort of, it's not ethical, but it's more of a mood thing that you want to be aware of if you're somebody going in to do an interview. There's a lot of ways that people infantilize disabled people, especially ones with pretty severe speech impairments and things. They'll kind of belittle, infantilize them, or they'll talk to the person they're with and not with them, and all of that stuff. So the trick is to really look at the person that you want to be interviewing, and even if there's somebody else interpreting there, you only look at that person. And so for if there's a sign language interpreter, don't look at the interpreter. Just look at the person you're interviewing, and you just keep directing your question to the deaf person. And in the sign language interpreter will respond in spoken language, but you just keep looking at the deaf person. They're the ones that are talking. So that's maybe, I don't know if that's ethical or not, but there's a pretty strong sense of that within the disability, within the deaf community. And, you might check in with the individual that you're working with and the interpreter before the interview and just say, okay, this is the way I understand the practice. Is that how you want it to go? And, take it from there.
No, that's great advice. I mean, especially about recognizing the humanity of the person that you're talking with.
Yeah, and then their agency too. It's not just humanity; it's agency, because there's so many times. I mean, I use a white cane in some situations, not all of them, and it's really interesting to me how often, if I'm with somebody else and I have my white cane, I would say well over 50% of the time, whoever we go up to, say in a restaurant or whatever, people will address the non-disabled person first. What does she want in her coffee? What is she, would she like to be, seated near the door or whatever, and it's so common and so yucky. So you got to just kind of know that there's that hurt. It's this cultural or some sort of sociological pain that's so common. And so if somebody talks to the other person, you'll immediately break that bond with the disabled person if you completely connect with the non-disabled person they're with.
Interviewing people with intellectual disability. Oral history can be an empowering tool for people with disabilities to claim their agency, express their voices, and shape how those stories are told and presented. Through oral history, people may reconsider people with disabilities as teachers, storytellers, or historians, giving a new appreciation for the value of lived experience. Only in recent decades have scholars considered intellectual disability history as a unique social category, thinking of people with intellectual disability as a marginalized social group. Oral history as life narrative research can serve as a platform that amplifies the voices of people with intellectual disability. Shared authority encourages researchers to include people with intellectual disability in the planning and carrying out of projects. During an oral history interview, interviewers should treat narrators as active agents in the process rather than passive subjects of study. The oral historian should grant authority and respect the autonomy of narrators. In the editing process, the oral historian should not distort, minimize, or co-opt the voice of the narrator, as is true in an oral history project, but this is especially important for people with a history of having their voices silenced and their agency disregarded. For a recent oral history project that focuses on self-advocacy and people with developmental disability, please see a project by the UC Berkeley Regional Oral History Office, the leaders with developmental disabilities in the self-advocacy movement. The self-advocacy movement is led and informed by people with developmental and intellectual disability. Self-advocacy. Oral histories with people with intellectual disability demonstrate that they understand their lives within context, reflect on their lives, advocate for themselves, express their concerns, and shape their stories. People with intellectual disability may struggle to recall dates, places, names, etc., which will present a challenge for researchers as they reconstruct chronologies and events. However, if you give the narrator space and time to tell their stories on their own terms, it reveals how, like all of us, people with disabilities seek to create identity and meaning through the stories they tell. What can we learn about identity, disability, and self-advocacy from this oral history with Chester Finn? Please click the link to consider Chester's perspective and how you might better accommodate someone you are interviewing. Informed consent accommodations. Researchers who focus on intellectual disability argue that excluding people with intellectual disability can further marginalize them. One way to make research more inclusive while upholding principles for ethical research is by considering having a third party grant consent on behalf of a person with a disability. However, having a proxy make decisions on behalf of the person with an intellectual disability may infantilize them or take away their self-advocacy and self-determination. Oral historians and all participants should consider during the pre-interview if the narrator has the ability to give informed consent. Speak with the narrator, someone close to the participant, a family member, guardian, and/or caregiver, to determine if the person can give informed consent. Keep in mind that parents or other service providers may act paternalistic. The oral historian should explain with transparency and accuracy the purposes of the project and answer their questions as fully as possible. But don't willingly let a caretaker make decisions for the narrator without communicating with them too. Be aware that the presence of another person during the interview may impact the oral history. Some narrators may be reluctant to discuss their lives in the presence of the person. Family members might interject or try to speak on behalf of the narrator. It is important to recognize the agency of the narrator when this happens. Explain these concerns in advance. It's important to do the research and read the literature, but it's vitally important to interact with the narrators. Oral history is very much an interpersonal relationship between the interviewer and the narrator. It's a dialectic communication. Viewing people not as research subjects, but as other human beings makes all the difference. Realizing that people with disabilities have diverse experiences and unique life contexts will also lead to a more substantial oral history interview. Avoid generalizing or presuming anything about the narrator. Ask them questions and represent their answers as truest to the context of the interview as possible. Don't interpret their stories for them. Please note that even though a person may have a disability, that does not mean they are incapable of exercising self-determination, reflecting on their lives, or understanding their experiences with a greater social context. See the following excerpt from the Self-Advocacy Project with Linda Kunick as she reflects on her life without literacy.
I wonder if you could speak to some of your own personal experiences, either as an interviewer who identifies with having a disability or with interviewing other people with disabilities. Can you give us a couple of examples of challenges?
I think I wouldn't. First of all, I wouldn't just limit it to challenges. There's a wonderful bonding that happens too. That when you are actually talking to somebody, even if they have a completely different disability, there's a way that you can laugh and connect over certain things. And also, I have felt more comfortable to ask for what I need in an interview situation. So, for example, if there was a thing where, say, there was a clock that was running and you knew that you had a certain amount of time, or sometimes with, and I'm basing this not on oral history interviews, but sort of when I've been on radio or television or things like that, where, there'll be some, little sign that somebody will give and you're supposed to see it, some cue visually. Well, I'm not going to see that. So, we'll spend some time talking about, well, okay, what kind of cue could you give me? And we'll joke about kicking each other under the table or, whatever. So I don't have to be all self-conscious about needing this accommodation. And so it's kind of a wonderful way to break the ice in a way. In terms of when that's not present, it's interesting to try to negotiate that with somebody that's making a whole set of assumptions about the way the environment works or doesn't work for somebody with a disability. And so when you're with, when I'm with somebody that has a disability, I'll be really likely to say, hey, I need this, this, and this, and oh yeah, I needed that too. And there'll be a whole connection around that might ultimately even create a bond that would establish more honest kind of questions and answers during the interview itself. And it's one of those, I can't point to a study or anything that happens. It's more of a feeling, but it's kind of great when it happens.
I mean, as an interviewer myself, I've had similar bonding experiences during oral history, in that there's a certain level of intimacy involved.
Mm-hmm.
With
it's a very intimate thing, and people don't realize that. And yeah, and I'm sure you have the same thing where people start out saying, I don't have anything to say. And like 3 hours later, you're like, yeah, you had a few things, you know. Yeah.
Well, a follow-up question to that is, have you ever experienced a narrator who might have something to say but doesn't necessarily believe that it's historically important?
Oh, yeah, all the time. Yeah, yeah. And in that case, I mean, historically important is always kind of a turnoff, I think, for people. So I just say, hey, tell me your story. Talk to me.
Location and accessibility. Questions about location, accessibility, and accommodations should be raised during the pre-interview. Always interview where the narrator feels comfortable and safe. Sometimes people may feel most comfortable doing an interview in their home. Remember that you are a guest there and that you should respect the space of the narrator. If you need to rearrange furniture, turn on lights, close curtains, or turn off any sounds, be sure to ask first and then rearrange everything back to the way it was before the interview. Others may not be comfortable inviting a stranger into their home. You should establish and accommodate any preferences on the location of the interview. Be mindful of accessibility issues for people with mobility disabilities. Arrange transportation if necessary. Some people will feel more comfortable meeting in a public space, such as a restaurant. These places should be avoided because they are loud, crowded, and unpredictable. Most public places or outside spaces are not usually conducive to recording a quality oral history interview. Be sure to communicate these concerns. Your priority is to ensure that the narrator is comfortable, but most people will understand if you suggest a quieter location. Pro tips: location and accessibility. If you agree to do the interview in someone's home, be courteous and respectful of that person's home. With permission, oral historians often rearrange furniture, adjust lights, turn off noise-making machines, or other attempts to improve the quality of the oral history recordings. Most people are very particular about their home, but someone with a visual disability, for example, may rely on the current arrangement of their home for mobility. So be sure to arrange it back the way it was before the interview. Talk to narrators about any concerns with lighting, noise, interruptions, and other factors which may impact the quality of the recording. For example, children, family, pets, people working in or outside the home all may interrupt the interview. Be sure to minimize these interruptions if possible. Most public libraries have quiet and accessible locations that can be scheduled for interviews. Libraries are usually more accessible to people with disabilities too. Be sure to call these places in advance to make sure of their availability and accessibility. Ask the librarian if they have a conference room that you can book. These rooms are usually more private than a study room. Ask narrators if they have any additional needs or accommodations related to location. Additional accommodations. These considerations should not be considered comprehensive or universal, but instead should raise your awareness to some additional questions to address in the pre-interview. Time duration. Some people may not have the stamina to endure an interview for a lengthy amount of time. You should discuss these concerns before the interview begins, offer periodic breaks, and, if necessary, schedule follow-up interviews. Comfort. Some people, especially with bodily disabilities, may experience pain or discomfort after sitting for long periods of time. Other sensitivities may involve light, fragrances, sounds, allergies, or phobias. Again, be sure to discuss these during the pre-interview. Most people will gladly answer questions and appreciate the attentiveness. Interviewing while family are present. Sometimes a family member or loved one may wish to be present during an interview. A family member may be a source of comfort, but potentially may shape the content of an interview. These dynamics can strongly impact an oral history interview in numerous and unforeseeable ways. Having a family member present may prevent a narrator from disclosing some memories, may create emotional responses, or create distractions and interruptions. Be sure the narrator consents to having any other person present during the interview, including family members. When interviewing a person with a disability, these concerns may be especially important. A narrator may feel infantilized by a parent, for example. Oral historians should always address the narrator directly, recognizing the person's agency and humanity. We believe that the best way to learn oral history is to do oral history. You should now be aware of some major considerations for beginning, recording, and preserving oral histories. Doing oral histories with people with disabilities shares many of the concerns of doing oral history with all people. Be sure to review the key points of each episode and think about how these lessons apply to your next interview. You will likely encounter new situations as well, but remember, oral history starts and ends with good communication. Promote best practices. Ask questions, listen, and respect the wishes of the storyteller.